It was a good number of generations ago that lived the good Prince Jasper of the Red Fields, in a kingdom to the east of these lands, you know. He was a bright fellow, by all accounts. Bright enough that upon his 18th birthday the king entrusted to him lands and a castle on the southern border of the realm. The Red Fields they were called, for they had been the site of many terrible battles. Here Prince Jasper ruled, until the end of his days, quite successfully. There were no rebellions, so he must have been loved. All invasions were repelled, so he must have been a fine commander. And he would ultimately die of old age, so there must have been no assassinations. Yet a grim cloud hung over Jasper and his lands. Some say it was because he ruled over dangerous country. There was a hostile nation to the south and the east, and his lands were exposed to many terrible bandit raids. That, however, did not stop the good prince from taking a bride. He must have been around 24 when, on a fateful visit to a knight in search of military support, Jasper fell in love. Her name was Angela. She was the daughter of Sir Gregory, a loyal knight overseeing lands under the vassalage of Lord Walston, a name I'm sure that means little to you. Yet in those days Lord Edmund Walston was the king's close confidant. Angela, however, had no part in those politics. Aside from being a pawn, who one day would unite Sir Gregory's house with that of another, she was entirely innocent. Her only concern lay with whom she might meet from one day to the next, and the proper etiquette and courtesies when she met them. On this day, the Lady Angela would meet a prince. It was right after the evening's dinner. Jasper's negotiations had gone poorly, for Sir Gregory had grown comfortable and complacent in his lands, and cared little for the struggles of the outer provinces. Angela found Jasper in the castle gardens, basking in the cool night air and drinking in the scents of the many flowers. Angela sat down across from Jasper, and the two talked for a time. Jasper was not at all as she had imagined a prince might be. He was a tall, powerful man, true, yet he was also deathly pale, and his face was weathered with cares. Angela, likewise, was unlike any woman Jasper could have conceived of. Her face was mildly rounded, perfectly framing her delicate lips and large bright eyes. Her voice was soft, gentle, and as pure as driven snow. She was, quite simply, perfectly named. Despite Angela's interest in the prince, he had no tales to tell, no stories of his conquests and heroism. In fact, he appeared to find the matter distasteful, and quickly changed the subject each time the Lady Angela brought it up. Rather, he preferred to hear about her. Surely nothing in her life could compare to the intrigue of Prince Jasper's, and yet he listened, quite patiently, as she spoke of the small things in each of her days. He smiled often as she spoke of this or that acquaintance, or this or that obligation. To even the pettiest of her annoyances, Prince Jasper reacted with the utmost sympathy. He commented occasionally with a word or two of advice, but spoke little aside from a few questions. When finally Angela ran out of things to say, she was struck with the realization that this was the first man she had met who actually listened to her. As for Prince Jasper, all he said was, "Thank you," and "Good night." The following morning, before making his return home, Prince Jasper approached Sir Gregory with one last request. He wanted to marry Angela. Sir Gregory thought it over for a moment, unsure if he wanted his daughter to live in such dangerous territory. Yet when Angela came out to bid Jasper farewell, the knight's mind was made up for him. Angela beamed like the morning sun as she rushed out to meet Jasper a final time. The prince, who had been rather grim until then, met her expression with one of equal joy and intensity. Sir Gregory watched his daughter, the way she spoke to Jasper, and how the prince responded, and finally the knight gave a resigned sigh. Prince Jasper's departure was delayed nearly a week, and when he finally did leave, it was in the company of a joyful bride. The first cracks in their happy marriage appeared on the journey home. In that carriage Prince Jasper remained much as he had been while visiting Sir Gregory. As near as Angela could tell, this was the man she had fallen in love with. He behaved identically, treated her with the utmost tenderness and love, and smiled like a castaway rescued at each word she spoke. Yet through it all he spoke nothing of himself. A shadow fell across their carriage as they passed from the warm, green lands of her father into the lands of the red fields. The people tending to the farmlands changed visibly. Where once they had been lively, albeit hard at work, the new peasants appeared grim and sullen. Though they did not cheer at the prince's coming, neither did they frown. They didn't so much as look up as his carriage passed. "What's the matter with them?" Angela asked. The prince glanced out the carriage window as if seeing his own people for the first time, and the smile faded from his face. That was the first time the man Angela loved disappeared, replaced instead with a stranger, a grey reflection of his subjects. That was also the first time he would speak of himself. He spoke of wars and invasions, of bandits and thieves and assassins. He explained the need for even the common folk to be capable of swapping their tools for weapons at the drop of a hat, for at all hours of the day, even at the most peaceful of moments, death might swoop down upon them. Then he fell silent and spoke no more. Jasper's castle was as grim and sullen as his people, a black shadow rising against the setting sun, thrusting its towers and battlements against the sky in a silent plea for mercy. The interior was little more inviting. The chairs at his table were of cast iron, softened for occupation with black velvet cushions. The table, stretching the length of his feast hall, saw many empty seats. The servants were few and sparse, drifting about their work like phantoms in the torchlight. "Are there no guards?" Angela asked, noting a profound lack of security. "Many guards," Jasper answered. "You just have yet to see them." After dinner, Jasper and Angela walked the halls, their path lit by a tall, gaunt man carrying a candelabrum laden with spent, tired wax pillars. The two passed many doors, each one offered a name by the prince. "This one is the study," he would say. "You must never enter that one. This one is a guest bedroom. If you grow tired of ours, we can spend the night there instead. It sees little use. This one, the library. It's a cozy little place in a storm. Sometime we might read together. This is the armory. I doubt you'll have much use for that. This is..." and so on. It was the most he had spoken since they met. The days drifted by peacefully enough. Jasper treated Angela well. Still, her heart did not rest easy. There was something strange about that castle, even sinister. It felt dark, even during the day, as if the rising sun neglected to cast its rays through the castle windows. There was only one place where Angela did not feel a sense of growing dread, and that was the library. The servants kept the fireplace lit, and there was a collection of warm, comfortable chairs and even a couch to sit in around the fire. The decor was bright, colorful, and cheerful. Likewise, the books were also warm and friendly, happy tales set in happier times. Yet with the passing weeks, even the library took on a wistful feeling, as if the bright colors and pleasant books were trying to force their cheer. The only things that could lift Angela's sinking heart were her moments with Jasper. And there were many moments. Unfortunately, he had responsibilities besides Angela, matters of state and governance, some of which he claimed were unsuitable for tender eyes. Angela often wondered what he meant. The worst times, however, were when Jasper vanished into his study, the room Angela had been warned not to enter, and lingered there for hours at a time. On the occasions Angela asked about the matter, what was in the study, why didn't Jasper want her in there, or what he was doing, Jasper would grow silent, and a harsh expression would cross his face. Then he would look at Angela, and her loving husband would return, only to change the subject. One day, while the prince was occupied with his administrative duties, Angela crept to his study and tried the door. She found it locked. Peering through the keyhole, she saw a small, sparsely furnished room, much like any other. She could make out bookshelves piled with indistinct volumes bound in leather, and could just barely catch the edges of trophies, as of taxidermied animals, mounted on the walls. In the far corner there stood a wardrobe. Standing up, she shook her head, wondering what on earth Jasper was so eager to keep secret. That was what sparked her curiosity. And that was what would have driven her to creep after Jasper the next time he entered his study. But that never proved necessary. Dinner was pleasant as usual. At least it should have been. Angela felt a great tension building in her chest. It was the tension, the terror of one with a secret. And as she and Jasper passed the meal, with forced conversation, Angela recognized the same disquiet in the prince that she also felt. She also noticed she had begun to talk less. "Is something the matter?" Jasper finally asked. Angela shook her head. Jasper set his knife down and rested his chin on the back of his fist, gazing long and hard at her. Then he shook his head and looked away. "This is wrong. Perhaps I've grown hard over the years. Perhaps I no longer feel the dread of this place. Perhaps I never should have wed you." Angela shuddered. The prince's words felt like a knife twisting into her side. "I'm sorry," Jasper finished. "Please, forgive me." He snapped his fingers and gestured for a servant to take his plate away. With a heavy sigh, he looked back up at Angela and gazed sorrowfully into her eyes. In that moment, Angela froze, the chunk of meat still on the end of her fork, mid-bite. At last she answered, "You're forgiven. Of course you're forgiven." The prince gave a rueful half-smile and ran a hand through his hair. "Is there some place you'd like to go? Some place more cheerful, perhaps?" Before she knew what she was saying, Angela felt her lips speaking. "Your study." Immediately, the prince's face transformed. Gone was Angela's beloved husband, replaced with his cold, gray doppelganger. "My... what?" "Your study," Angela repeated. "I suppose it's my turn to apologize now. While you were out today, I stole a peek through the keyhole." The prince's face turned even paler than usual. "You... saw? And you're still here?" "Why wouldn't I be? It's just a study like any other." The prince was silent for a time, staring down at the round wrinkle in the tablecloth where his plate had been. He rubbed his forehead. He gasped, he grunted, and he sighed. When at last he raised his gaze to meet Angela's, her husband had returned. No, not her husband. A new man. This one was relaxed, at peace, as if a great burden had been lifted from his shoulders. He smiled like Jasper had never smiled before. "Very well, my love. Let's go." Angela's smile wasn't quite as strong. There was still a pall of curiosity floating over her head, casting its shadow upon her as she took Jasper's hand and followed after him. His steps grew lighter and quicker with each stride. Angela found herself struggling to keep up. The prince walked like a prisoner set free. Arriving at the locked door, the prince fumbled with his key, his hands growing numb and flopping about in his eagerness to reveal his final secret to his wife. After a time, Angela gently took a hold of the prince's hands and eased the key into place herself. Though the prince danced into the room as joyously as if it were Christmas morning, Angela took only a few steps before she froze in her tracks. The trophies on the wall, they were not deer or elk or boar or any other sort of large game. They were human heads, each labeled with a brass plaque bearing the name of its former owner. "These," the prince explained, "once belonged to my enemies, officers I defeated in battle, enemies of the king. And this—" The prince flung open his wardrobe, but Angela paid no attention. Her gaze was drawn to the books on the shelves. They were bound in no mere leather. She recognized the textures of pores and sparse hairs sprouting from their covers. They were bound in human skin. "This is my coat of arms," the prince announced. From the wardrobe he drew forth what appeared at first to be no more than a lump of flesh. Yet as he draped it across his shoulders, it sprang to life, spreading, unfurling, and flexing under its own volition. Dozens of human arms, the skin of varying shades, the muscle of varying tones, were sewn together, attached to a broad stretch of membrane and sinew which now enfolded the prince's back. "Why settle for 2 hands when I can have many?" At this the prince stretched and curled and flexed his many arms in tandem. "Why embrace you with only 2? When I can embrace you with many?" But Angela did not share in the prince's joy. She felt great waves of nausea sweeping through her as her stomach sank into her hips. That was when the heads, as if awakened by the sudden sensations and feelings returning to their many hands, began to scream. No sound came from their throats as their mouths stretched and contorted, their necks twisting and writhing this way and that as they stared in wide-eyed horror at one another, having just awakened to a living, unending nightmare. Then there was a sound, the sound of Angela screaming as her lips split wide, open in abject horror. "I don't understand," the prince began to say when Angela turned and fled. He called after her, "Wait! I can explain!" The time for explanations, however, had long passed. Angela fled through the halls with no clear idea where she would go if she escaped. All she could think was that she could not stay. Behind her she heard the sounds of large, heavy footsteps in hot pursuit, as the monster she had married gave chase, crying out for her to come back, to give him another chance. But the prince's last chance had been spent long ago. Angela was not in a reasoning mood, for she had witnessed a horror beyond reasoning. She leaped down the steps into the dining hall, dashed through the far door into the throne room, and out the main gates. Down the front steps she darted, to the carriage and driver that waited before the grim castle. She cried out for help, cried out for the driver to take her as far from that place as he could go. But when he turned to acknowledge her, Angela saw not the kindly face she remembered, but instead a grinning skull staring back at her. The jaw moved as if to answer, only to pop loose and tumble from the driver's face, landing with a clatter at Angela's feet. All around in the evening shadows, pale, slender forms stirred, the prince's unseen guards finally revealed as they crawled out of the ground, marching in a silent, deathless procession to take up their positions at the evening watch. Angela whispered in despair as she sank to her knees, shedding tears of shock and horror as her entire world flipped upside down. And then she felt the hands grasping at her arms, not the skeletal, claw-like hands of the guards, but the muscular, coordinated, and living hands of the prince himself. He pulled the screaming lady from the ground, dozens upon dozens of hands swarming across her like spiders, as the prince shouted for her to listen. He promised he could explain, assured her he had no choice in the matter, that as his men dwindled and reinforcements remained a distant prayer, he had to take increasingly desperate measures to protect his lands. But by now Angela was hysterical. She cried like a frightened child, wailing for it all to simply stop. Jasper tried to console her, but she struggled relentlessly, and the more she fought, the tighter his grip became. A hand covered her mouth, stifling her cries. More hands crawled across her back and arms, fingers digging into her tender skin. Yet when at last his bride grew still, the time for words had already passed. Jasper's eyes grew wide in horror at the work of his hands. He held Angela in his arms and wept, as no man should ever be driven to weep, for his beloved was dead. The next morning dawned cold and grey. A solitary carriage rumbled down the road to the castle, driven by a living man and drawn by living horses. When Sir Gregory strode through the castle gates, he was greeted with the smiling faces of his daughter and her beloved groom. It proved a pleasant visit. Angela was in good spirits, and had only good things to say about her new life here. Jasper was as kind and gentle as ever before, though he often appeared rather somber, even a little sad. When Sir Gregory remarked on the seeming absence of any guards, Angela assured him they were there. He simply hadn't seen them. In all, Sir Gregory was quite pleased with his visit, and left sure of the wisdom of his decision to allow the marriage. Even so, there had been something rather odd about it all. One small thing he just couldn't shake, try as he might. In all the time the knight had spent with them, he had not seen his daughter leave the prince's side, even once. It was almost as if the two were attached.